Chapter 2 Lesson 1 Government in Colonial America. Our Political Heritage. Which historical events, documents, and philosophers influenced American colonists' ideas about government? During the 1600s, people from Europe migrated to North America, settling along the Atlantic coast and inland. The great majority of the colonists were Christians familiar with both the Old and New Testament of the Christian Bible. They brought with them Judeo-Christian values and ideas derived from biblical law. For example, the Old Testament discusses how the law should apply equally to all people, even kings, and sets forth rules for a fair trial. These beliefs made an important contribution to the founding principles and documents of the United States. Most of the early colonists were from England and considered themselves British. The English settlers formed 13 colonies under charters from the King of England. Their ideas about the role and shape of government influenced the growth of the colonies, the American Revolution, and the system of government we have today. Many of their ideas about government had been developing in Europe for centuries, including the two basic principles of limited government and representative government. Limited government. By the time the first European colonists settled North America, the idea of limited government, the concept that a government's power was not absolute, was accepted in England. Centuries earlier, in 1215, English nobles were upset with the oppressive policies of King John, including unfair taxation and cruel treatment of prisoners. They forced him to sign a document, the Magna Carta, recognizing their rights. The nobles did not think the Magna Carta established permanent principles of government, nor were they thinking of the rights of common people. As the centuries passed, however, the English people came to regard the Magna Carta as a guarantee of limited government. They believed it protected people from unjust punishment by the government and from the levying of taxes without popular consent. English Bill of Rights. Even after the signing of the Magna Carta, power struggles between the monarchy and Parliament, England's lawmaking body, persisted for more than 400 years. In 1688 Parliament removed King James II from the throne with little resistance. It chose two new monarchs who recognized Parliament as supreme, William III and Mary II. In 1689 Parliament passed the English Bill of Rights, which set clear limits on the monarchy. It said, "Monarchs do not have absolute authority, but rule with the consent of the people's representatives in Parliament. Monarchs must have Parliament's consent to suspend laws, levy taxes, or maintain an army. Monarchs cannot interfere with parliamentary elections and debates. The people have a right to petition the government and to have a fair and speedy trial by a jury of their peers. The people should not be subject to cruel and unusual punishments or to excessive fines and bail." The influence of the English Bill of Rights was felt directly in the American colonies. The colonists believed the document applied to them, and that they had the same rights as people living in Britain. The king, however, had a different perspective. He saw colonists as subjects of the British Empire without the same rights as those living in Britain. These differing ideas were a major cause for the American Revolution. English law. The English system of law also had a major influence in the colonies, especially through the work of Sir William Blackstone. Blackstone's Commentaries on the Laws of England, 1766, helped codify English common law and was widely followed by the founders. Blackstone believed the source of all human law was derived from the law of nature and the law of revelation, the Bible, and that no human laws should be suffered to contradict these. Representative government. The colonists firmly believed in representative government, a government in which people elect delegates to make laws and conduct government. This notion was familiar to the colonists because Britain's Parliament was a representative assembly with the power to enact laws. It had two chambers. The members of the upper chamber, the House of Lords, were the first sons of noble families, and later members inherited their positions. The members of the lower chamber, the House of Commons, were elected. Since very few common or poor people were allowed to vote, members of the House of Commons were often the younger sons of noble families or wealthy commoners. New political ideas, the social contract and natural rights. European philosophers and their ideas about government deeply influenced American colonists. During the late 1600s and 1700s, Europe experienced a major intellectual movement known as the Enlightenment. During the Enlightenment, Europeans challenged the rule of leaders who claimed to have power because of divine right or by God-given authority, and began to consider different ideas about what makes government legitimate. English philosopher Thomas Hobbes argued that people create a society by entering into a social contract. According to this theory, people need government to maintain order, because they have not yet learned to live in groups without conflict. Under this social contract theory, people give up their individual sovereignty to the government. In exchange, the government provides peace and order. Like Hobbes, John Locke and Jean-Jacques Rousseau developed ideas about the purposes of government and the social contract. John Locke, an English philosopher, reasoned that people have natural rights, those rights people have simply because they are human beings. He named those natural rights as the right to life, liberty, and property. He theorized that people made a contract among themselves to create a government to protect their natural rights. If, however, a government failed to protect these rights, people were justified in rebelling and changing that government. For Locke, government was legitimate only as long as the people continued to consent to it. Swiss-born political theorist Jean-Jacques Rousseau believed that property rights and other basic rights, such as freedom of speech and religion, came from people living together in a community. By working cooperatively, people created a social contract that allowed them to preserve their rights while at the same time creating law and government. Charles Louis de Montesquieu, a French Enlightenment thinker, wrote about the importance of separating the powers of government. In the spirit of the laws, he said, there can be no liberty where the legislative and executive powers are united in the same person. Or, if the power of judging be not separated from the legislative and executive powers. While the colonists' ideas about government were rooted in Christianity, educated colonists were familiar with the ideas of Blackstone, Hobbes, Locke, and other Enlightenment thinkers. The Declaration of Independence and the Constitution reflected these ideas. Colonial governments. How were democratic ideals incorporated into colonial governments? Their English heritage and the political philosophers of the Enlightenment influenced the colonists' notions of representative government, republicanism, constitutionalism, and law. Each of the 13 colonies had its own government consisting of a governor, usually appointed by the king, a legislature, elected at least in part, and a court system. These colonial institutions exercised some authority, but the British believed that all colonists owed allegiance to the monarch. The governments the colonists established were not democratic, as we would define the term today. Democracy at this time meant that it was possible for a working farmer, for example, to have his views heard in local meetings or to vote on certain issues in some colonies. By contrast, women and enslaved people could not vote, and every colony had some type of property qualification for voting. Land was abundant and cheap, however, so compared to Europe, a relatively large percentage of the white, male population could vote. 9 of the 13 colonies had an official or established church, and many colonists remained intolerant of religious dissent. In Puritan town meetings, for example, voting was originally reserved for members of the community church. Despite such shortcomings, however, colonial governments established practices that later became a key part of the nation's system of government. Written constitutions. A key feature of the colonial period was government according to a written plan. The Mayflower Compact that the Pilgrims signed in 1620 was the first of many colonial plans for self-government. Men of the Pilgrim families drew up the document in the tiny cabin of their ship, the Mayflower, anchored off the New England coast. The Pilgrim leaders realized they needed rules to govern themselves if they were to survive in the new land. Through the Mayflower Compact, they agreed to choose their own leaders and to make their own laws. Puritan immigrants established the Massachusetts Bay Colony, and in 1636 the colony adopted the first system of laws in the English colonies. In 1639 colonists in Connecticut drew up America's first formal constitution, or charter. The Fundamental Orders of Connecticut gave the people the right to elect the governor, judges, and representatives to make laws. Soon after, other English colonies created their own charters with similar provisions. The actions of colonial legislatures and courts could be reviewed and rejected by a committee of the King's Privy Council, but the colonies actually practiced a great deal of self-government. Colonial charters divided the power of government among the governor, the legislative assembly, and the courts. The governor, the king's agent in the colonies, had executive power, while the legislative assembly had the power to pass laws. Colonial courts applied the law in court cases. Colonial legislatures. The composition of the colonial legislatures varied. In some places, the king exercised his role as the head of the church and appointed bishops and clergy to serve in the colonial legislatures. In other places, especially where many American Puritans had settled, colonists rejected the tradition of the king acting as head of the church. The Puritans had migrated to America to gain the freedom to organize their churches as they chose and believed that each congregation should choose its ministers. They also believed that church members should elect their government. In 1636, Puritans in Massachusetts forced their leaders to allow each town to elect 2 members of the General Court, the colony's legislature. By the mid-1700s, the legislative bodies of colonial government were dominant in political life. The rapidly growing colonies constantly needed new laws to cope with new circumstances. For example, they had to control the distribution of land and lay out plans for public buildings. They also had to build roads and ferries that were vital to the economy, and set up schools and courts. By 1776, representative government was a well-established tradition in America. Most colonial legislatures had been operating for over 100 years, and they became the training grounds for the political leaders who wrote the Declaration of Independence and, later, the U.S. Constitution. The combination of their English heritage and colonial experience in representative self-government made them leaders in what one historian called the seed time of the Republic.